At last, we are finally back to talking about cards where I fundamentally disagree with the most common interpretations. So way back when I started this series and I talked about the Fool and the Magician, I mentioned that they were two cards in a series that got sort of major glow-ups when the Golden Dawn got their hands on those cards. And the Hanged Man is sort of the third of that trio. And I would argue, by most standards, the Hanged Man kind of got the biggest change. It's actually interesting to me that the Golden Dawn stayed with that title. They didn't have to. They changed whatever they wanted to whenever they felt like it. So they could have made it into something else. And maybe they didn't because it was nebulous enough and it didn't retain the Italian version of the name, which would have been the Traitor. So the Hanged Man, which is what it is in French, La Pendue, came into English as the Hanged Man, and it just sort of felt innocuous enough, I would imagine. But it's interesting because the source of this card is very different from the way that we interpret it. And actually, it's moved a lot over history, even since Waite. So Waite sort of talked about this card having to do with initiation. And there is sort of a long history of initiates or heroes, heroines, and myths sort of coming into their power by going through sort of a suffering and a metaphorical death. You know what I mean? You can think of Jesus in the myths about Christ, sort of going through that death to come back to life, or even the Buddha starving before discovering enlightenment, right? So these kinds of tropes, these kinds of ideas of suffering to come into one's power, suffering even a literal death or a metaphorical death in order to come into your power, were kind of where I think Waite was going with this, and there were initiations and rites within the Golden Dawn that sort of created a initiatory death as people moved up that ladder. And so I think he also talks about the card as actually physical death at one point. But I think the main idea that we get is the idea of a metaphorical death in order to initiate into something higher. Now, it's interesting, if you do consider the Trumpson Order, the card that follows this is death. So it's an interesting pairing, and actually in the Justice card, I talked about how you can create this little trio of Justice, the Hanged Man, and Death as sort of the sentencing, the sentence, and then the completion, the death, if you will, state-sponsored execution, So it is an interesting card, and since that time, I think we've even kind of gotten away from that, and maybe it's because that's not as active a part of our lives anymore, this idea of being initiated into things. And so it's really become sort of about a perspective shift or a perception shift. And it's about seeing things in a different way, which I guess if you're hanging upside down, does mean you will see things differently. I don't think you'll necessarily see them better, but it has become this thing about sort of changing our perception, having a new worldview. Fine, again, I don't want to take shit away from people, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The guy's not hanging there because he wants to be. He's being punished for something. And that takes us back through history to that Italian interpretation of the card as the traitor. Now, there's some geopolitical stuff I'm going to bring up in this video. I am going to touch on some anti-Semitic tropes that might be alive and well in this card, so I just want to put that out there for anyone who feels unsafe in that discussion. But I think it is interesting to understand where these ideas come from, and I think it's important to understand certainly the injustices that follow us through the ages. So let's unpack that a little bit. This card is often depicted in the Marseille decks as Judas, and you can see that in the pieces of the little blobs that are falling away from the Hanged Man, which really are supposed to represent the pieces of silver that he received for betraying Christ to the authorities. Judas is a complicated character in mythological history, and in the world's relationship to Judaism. I bring this up because there are some scholars, not a lot, but you can sort of read about this if you explore it. You can start your journey on Wikipedia and then link out to scholarly, primary sources who have evidence that there were parts of Europe in the 13th century, primarily parts of Germany, parts of France, where this punishment, reversed hanging, was reserved specifically for Jews accused of theft. And notice that I said Jews accused of theft not necessarily Jews who were thieves, because it didn't matter whether or not they were thieves. For real, what mattered is that they had been accused of it. And they would either be left there to die or left there until they agreed to convert to Christianity, and then they would be brought down and eventually die from injuries sustained from hanging upside down for as long as it took for them to decide to convert. It was essentially a form of torture. Why do I bring this up? Well, I think that it's important to understand, especially these days where anti-Semitism is alive and well and living, certainly in the United States, that these things aren't new, and it's helpful to understand how far back they go and how deeply fucked up they are. That's one part of it. But I think there's something to be said for this card representing injustice. When we talked about justice, I mentioned that this card creates that trio that I mentioned earlier with death, of sort of the sentence, the sentencing, the sentence, and the consequence of that sentence. Justice, as we talked about in that video, is not always fair. It's not always just. It is a mechanism of power. And you see that in times in history where it was used in the way that I just described the hanged man historically, because it didn't matter whether or not someone was guilty of a crime truly, just that someone in power had decided that they were and then had the power to punish them. And use that punishment as a torture tool in order to get them to convert to Christianity. I think that if there is a card in the deck that highlights the injustices that can come with power, it's this one. Certainly if you were to pair this card with the Hierophant, for example, and Justice, or some other cards in that realm, you could definitely see the Hanged Man not as the consequence of justice being served in some cases, but as an injustice, an abuse of power for which someone is suffering unjustly. And if you read with reversals, which I don't, but if you do, a reverse justice and the Hanged Man could definitely suggest that. Now, are you going to bring up anti-Semitism in your readings? I wouldn't imagine that's going to come up very much. But the historical injustice of that, tied to our modern understanding of injustice, can be really interesting if you're doing a reading where that kind of bias might be at play. You know, and I'll get comments that sometimes say, well, that really doesn't come up. Well, it doesn't come up for you. But there are people who I've had private conversations with for whom these topics come up frequently in tarot. And we need cards to be able to identify them. And I wanted to bring up this complicated history with the card also because I don't want us to whitewash history. I don't want us to take away all of the fucked up stuff that came out of Europe at the same time that tarot did. It came out of its time, it came out of its place, and I think that we can adapt it for modern use, certainly. And helping to understand the history of where it came from can help us understand why the things that are in the deck are there, and then to help us make sense of them in modern life, use them in readings in modern life, but also to change our own perceptions so that we can see the world differently and more clearly, especially when it comes to injustice, which, you know, is a theme many of us care about. And it's affecting a lot of folks. So that's the complex geopolitical history of this. Let's talk about some less icky topics when it comes to this card. So considering that the card was originally called the Traitor, it could in some contexts represent betrayal of any kind. You know, if you saw the Hanged Man in a relationship reading, it could suggest someone has been unfaithful, particularly with cards that can be tricky, like the Magician. Or anything, you know, if you work with astrology, anything connected to like mercurial natures, right? Like someone's being mercurial, someone's being tricky, and there may have been a betrayal. It doesn't need to be as big as being unfaithful either. It could literally be like, you promised you would not tell my mother I said that kind of thing. You know, you promised you would not tell my sister I hate her ex-husband. Whatever the case is, there's some kind of betrayal at work there if you see the Magician in a reading, depending on the context of the cards. You know, the Magician and the Lovers and the Hanged Man could suggest some kind of relationship betrayal. With the Emperor or the Empress, with lots of wands or coins cards, maybe like a work betrayal, you know, someone stole your position, or you got something underhanded happen to you, or you're betraying someone. You know, again, context. But the card, just at its core, to go back to its literal historical title, can tell us something, certainly in some contexts. A way that I commonly read this card is just as consequences of any kind. And consequences don't need to be bad. You know what I mean? Like the consequence of a date could be the beginning of a beautiful relationship. And so that's another way the Hanged Man and the Lovers might function if paired in a reading. Certainly with, more romantic cards, the Two of Cups, say, or the Ace of Cups, things that are very emotional and early in their stages, like the consequence of a date, the Hanged Man has consequences, might be a relationship. On the other hand, the consequence of a date might be really disliking somebody. But consequences of all kinds for me exist in that. I like the idea of having a card that represents consequences in readings to kind of touch on something I talked about last week, which was the way in which spiritual bypassing and toxic positivity can sort of whitewash tarot and sort of try to empower us out of having any kind of consequences for our actions. I think there are times where there are consequences for doing things. The consequence of me eating this pizza is that I will not lose weight or that I will gain weight. The consequence of drinking too much is that I will have a hangover. You know what I mean? There are consequences in life all the time. The consequences of me stealing from my boss are that I will get fired. Consequences, life is just full of them. And so to have a card that talks about that, I think is super useful. I mean, let's say you're doing a reading about how will this move go? You're moving into a new apartment, you're doing it all yourself, and you get the Hanged Man and the Ten of Swords. The Hanged Man might suggest that a consequence of moving yourself might be that you have back pain or need back surgery as a result. You know what I mean? Because if we just sort of look past what we think we see at the Ten of Swords, what we've got is knives in a back. So that could suggest back pain, or it could suggest needing back surgery. You know what I mean? You might injure yourself in such a way that you will cause damage to your back. So just make sure you lift from the knees. You know what I mean? That's an example of how this card can function in a smaller, contextually accurate way. And the way that the Ten of Swords even, traditionally a kind of negative card, not in this case that it's positive, but when we talk about scope and size, that's a more appropriate answer for someone who's going to be lifting boxes than something maybe more dire. You know what I mean? You're going to get back pain, or you're going to need back surgery or something like that. On the other hand, the Hanged Man and the Six of Wands in a reading about how will this job interview go could suggest success. The consequence of the job interview will be that you get the job. So there's another way that consequences can function. And it's sort of a grace note in that kind of reading. It's not, we think of the major arcana cards as always sort of major and huge, and I don't really read with them that way. Sometimes they represent big, huge things, but sometimes they are sort of a grace note. They're a linking verb. The consequence of this will be this. So how will this job interview go? As a consequence of doing it, you will get the job. It's a complicated card with a complicated history, and I think it's worth knowing what that history is, or opening ourselves up to experiencing history through kind of an unvarnished lens. But I also think that just going back to the heart of the card, just going back to what we are seeing, can really do a lot for helping us interpret cards and readings and getting away from kind of textbook examples. As I have said time and time again in this series, there's nothing wrong with those, but they're not always helpful. And in my case, I found them helpful very rarely because I was giving really kind of textbook readings. For a long time, I sort of felt like I was giving just recitations of meanings. I wasn't tying meaning into the card, into the context, into the question. It was all about the card meaning and not about the person I was reading for, even if that person I was reading for was me. And at some point I needed to give myself permission to step away from that and think about the cards in other ways. And that again is the purpose of this, is to challenge you to consider the card differently. You know what I mean? Maybe you don't need the historical anti-Semitic context, which again is not widely scholarly explored. So I can't say for certain that that was true, but there is evidence out there that suggests it was, and given the way we know the world works, it wouldn't shock me to find out that it is true. But to even go back to the idea of the Hanged Man as someone who's being punished, who is in a position of bodily trauma, you know what I mean? To me, it's more complex and more nuanced than just a perception shift. Sure, there are times where we do have perception shifts. Sure, there are times where contextually that makes sense in a reading, and there's nothing wrong with having that. But when we look at what we're really seeing in decks, well, I should say not in most decks, what we're seeing in originally is someone who's being punished. And that's something that happens to us in life. It's one reason, too, I will say, that I don't like when decks take, the Hanged Man and make it into the Hanged One, or something like that, or even put, a bat on it, because bats are supposed to be hanging upside down. You know what I mean? It just, contextualizes the card in a completely different way, I don't mind the old titles in a lot of cases, because I think there's something more honest about what we're seeing. It doesn't sort of put a big coat of whitewash over it. But again, that's just me. So next week we're going to talk about death. How fun is that? So as always, be good, take care, we'll talk soon.